Hello everyone and welcome back to Mix TV mixing and mastering tutorials on YouTube. I'm your host David, and with this video I want to answer all the questions that I get about what are my favorite plugins, my go-tos for this or that instrument or application. And I love to answer your questions on the comments, but since we are at the end of the year, I thought I could make a video also to see for myself which ones I ended up using the most in 2016. I'll list all my favorite plugins divided by category and briefly describe what do I use them for, how and why. So without further ado, let's start with my default EQ and dynamic. My default EQ, as you can see, is the EQ 7 bands stock EQ that comes with Pro Tools. I'd say 60% of the EQ in my mixes is this one. It's got 5 parametric bands, filters, input and output levels, and most times this is all I need for EQ. It just works. And you can say whatever you want about stock EQs or stock plugins in general, but the truth is stock plugins, especially Pro Tools ones, are more commonly used than people think, as most engineers in the industry use Pro Tools still. And you will find a good amount of stock plugins on any session. If anything, because you know that whatever you send your session to, or if you transfer it on a different system, you're gonna find the stock plugins. But that aside, it's a digital EQ, it does its job well, and it has some good soloing features too. So this is what I use for the most part when I need clean EQ. The other option for clean EQ would be FabFilter Pro Q2. The main reason I'd switch to this is if I need the analyzer and or if I need to do some wacky EQ on something, mostly notching or really zooming in on something. And I keep this in a 0 latency mode down here because I don't know what it is, I don't know why, but there's something that I don't like about the natural phase. But this is just me, so I keep it at 0 latency. The next default would be the SSL G channel. You know, I open this plugin on every channel by default on my mixes. If I only have to have one plugin, this would be it. Channel strip with EQ filters, dynamic, both compression and expander gate. This is my first slot by default. And in my default preset, the default preset I created myself, the analog, aka noise, is off. That goes for every plugin with this feature. The routing default, because you can change the routing in this plugin, is set to split up here. That puts filters first and the channel out is on. So compression comes after the EQ. So this is my default. You can change the routing, as I said. That's one of the great things about this plugin. And the routing options are different from the E to the G, and it's a big difference. I might make a video about that specifically if you guys are interested. I use it on every channel. Usually for the filters and the first basic EQ, mostly corrective EQ as in cutting, but I do boost with this too. Specifically, and that's one of the reasons I like the G channel better, the low mid band with the switch that divide the frequency by 3 active. I find it one of the most focused low boost out there. With a variable Q, I can go really narrow and still sounds good. I also use the compressor section a lot to give things just a little hump, just a little more grit. It's not necessarily compressing when I use it that way, in that you don't need to actually do gain reduction or see it in the meter. But this is a well-known trick, if you will, on the SSL boards. If you turn the thresholds knob up, the sound gets punchier and a bit more in your face without actually being compressed or adding anything too noticeable. I think Waves did a really good job with this particular section. I use the E channel instead on a few elements when I want a more modern sound and something with a bit more bite, or when I need to use its internal sidechain. When I want the compressor to react to a specific frequency using the internal sidechain and the different routing of the E channel. Used as a de-esser, for example, works great. Let's keep going by category and see what are some of my highlighted EQs here. Now, just because I have some plugins highlighted doesn't mean I use them often. Some of them are there for the opposite reason, because I don't use them often and I tend to forget about them. But yeah, we've seen my 2 clean favorite EQs, the stock 7 bands and the Pro Q2. If I want a parametric or a semi-parametric with color, I would go either for the API 550B or the VQ4. These are two of my favorites. I had a bunch of hardware 550Bs and I love the API sound. These don't really sound like the hardware, but they do sound good and close enough to give me a familiar sound and workflow. Usually API EQs go on instruments like guitars, bass, and drums. When the API sound doesn't fit for some reason, I switch to the VQ4 and that usually works. I use it often on vocals, on groups, but yeah, they are pretty much interchangeable for me depending on the style of the song and how many tracks and so on. Another one I use very often is the standalone SSL EQ. If I used all the bands on the G channel and I still want that sound, I'll open up one of these. For example, if I use the low mid band on the channel for cutting and I need that focused low boost we talked about, I'll use this. Another EQ for color, in this case for broad strokes, would be the PukeTech. I don't use this too often, but enough. And when I need the Pultec style EQ, this is it for me. Usually on bass and drum bus, that's where this one sees the more action. The low band trick works as expected, and I also use its low pass filter, which works very well to smooth out harsh sounding tracks. The high boost is also nice on some things. You can push it quite a bit if you keep the bandwidth broad. Next one would be the Mag EQ4. I love this one on either drum bus, and I usually use this only for the air band and occasionally to cut some sub on the drum bus. But I use it on vocals as well. Sometimes he ends up on the 2-bus, but that's not my first choice for 2-bus. My first choice for the 2-bus would be instead the Brainworks digital EQ. And I know there's a new version out, someday I'll try that, but yeah, for me, this is the 2-bus EQ. I absolutely love the high band, usually somewhere between 12K and 18K, 1 up to 4 dB boost in shelf usually, and that's how I usually end up on the 2-bus. Occasionally, I use this also to boost 1 or 2 dB at the bottom, 70, 50, it depends, but yeah, this is my favorite EQ for the mix bus. Honorable mention for EQs goes to the SPL Pass EQ. I don't use this that much, but it has one trick that nobody can touch. Its high band boost is second to none. It doesn't work on every material, but when it works, like nothing can touch this thing. It's fantastic sounding. Unfortunately, I don't really like the other bands. The low boost, it's sometimes useful, but a little goes a long way, like a little like this. On 40 or 20 or 10, it adds a lot of weight, but really, you need to be conservative with this. With the high boost, you can go overboard on some material, and it just keeps sounding better the more you turn the knob. So that's another great one. And this is it for EQs. Let's go with the dynamic. The first one would be the API 2500. I have the hardware and I use this plugin all the time. It's definitely one of the best sounding compressor for me. Very versatile, not too tweaky, few parameters, easy to set and get a good sound out of it. I could mix a song just using this compressor, but again, a lot has to do with familiarity for me with this one. But it's a great workhorse compressor overall. It ended up on the 2-bus often in past, not so much these days. My 2-bus chain is hardware 99% of the times, but I love it on guitars. That's actually where I use my hardware these days often. Love it on vocals too, on snare specifically, the plugin I'm talking about. It's also one of my favorite parallel compressors. I send different stuff to it in parallel. It changes every mix, but yeah, I usually have 4 parallel compressor aux, and this is one of them, and I'm talking in the box. Another dynamic, even if it's not a compressor per se, would be the Brainworks Dynamic EQ. This is my absolute favorite to dynamically notch offending notes on bass and vocals. You can be really surgical with this. So that's what I use it for, when you have that one boomy note on bass that pops out here and there, and a harsh consonant on vocals keep popping out. Instead of static EQ, this dynamic EQ can really solve problems like this easily. In the same categories of dynamic EQs, there would be the Tokyo Dome Lab Nova. I would use this instead of the Brainworks Dynamic EQ when I need more bands, obviously, And for less surgical work, for no real reason, I just, it's easier to see a wider frequency range on this one on the display. But yeah, I use this one on the tubas too sometimes, but usually more on groups like guitar or bass or vocals, not too much on transients and fast events, but more as a frequency selective leveler, I would say. Great plugin, and it's free. In the same family, there would be the Waves C6. This is still one of my favorite multiband compressor for single channels. My main application is vocals. That's usually one of the first processing after the SSL channel when I need multiband compression. And the reason I put it as a first processing is because just inserting it, it changes the sound a bit due to the crossovers, obviously. And while it is a familiar sound, for me at least, I rather have that change right away and adjust what's needed as the mix goes on. The C6 is also what I use to sidechain the kick to duck the low end of the bass with the sidechain version of it, which is what is shown here. It's great because you can assign internal or external sidechain on each band individually, leaving the others reacting to the actual material. This way I can tailor which part of the low end of the bass gets ducked when the kick hits. On bass, usually I sidechain the low band here, the shelf one, to duck the subs at every kick hit. And I use the free low band here, leave it on its internal sidechain to control a specific narrow range or a recurring boomy note on the bass. Same concept for vocals, but without the sidechain. I use it as a dual de-ester. The high band, used as a broad high frequency leveler, gets usually boosted up a couple of dBs to reintroduce air on the vocals. And then the free blue band here to focus on harsh consonants and S's, fast recurring vents on vocals. Also, I'll focus the low mid band on the body of the vocals, around here, 250, 120, anywhere in that range depending on the vocal, and usually gain the band up a bit, compressing when it gets into boomy territory. In both cases, I keep the release manual usually, and there's rarely anything more than 4 dB of either boost or gain reduction at the most. Behavior is electro mode for bass usually and opto for vocals. If I need multiband compression on the tubas, which doesn't happen often, but sometimes it does, and or at the mastering stage, I use the linear phase multiband compressor, and usually it never does anything more than 2 dB top of compression on not even all the bands. And I gotta be honest, sometimes when a mix is finished, I do try to open this up if I feel I miss some cohesiveness in the mix, if that makes sense. And sometimes this just works, just glue things together. Like I said, it's not really, it's not really about the gain reduction. It's a nice plugin to try to use as a finisher, so to speak. But yeah, pay attention to it because it can really, really mess with the balance of a mix quickly if you don't know what you're doing. So yeah, this is another good one. Honorable mention in the dynamic category would be FabFilter Pro MB, which takes the place of the C6 usually when I need the spectrum analyzer, especially because you can also see the sidechain input in the analyzer. So you can see 2 elements at the same time, the one you're processing and the external sidechain at the same time in the analyzer. And when I need to set up something fast, the Pro MB has a great interface. And when I'm working on a broad frequency range, because how the controls are labeled, I find this one forces me to go entirely by ear instead of focusing on specific numbers, attack release, and it makes me feel like I have more leeway for error, so to speak. It's somehow less precise in a good way, if that makes sense, compared to C6 or the Brainworks. Stock dynamic compressor, Dyne 3, is another of the most used. When I want something clean, no fuzz, extended sidechain functions, this is it. Usually I use it on effects return to duck, reverb, and delays, sidechain with the vocals, or other elements. But just as a general purpose compressor, I use this all the time. Instead, when I want some color, there will be a lot of compressor to name for me, but I'll try to narrow it down. We've already seen the API 2500. Another one would be the CLA 76. Again, I'm familiar with its action and sound. I have two hardware ones, and when I'm out of hardware, I use this instead. And I use the stereo version as one of my other parallel compressor, Eqs. I send various stuff to it, but I use it on insert, on snares and vocals a lot. I also have a specific trick for snares and drums with the 1176s. If you guys are interested, let me know and I'll show you in another video. Another amazing color compressor for me would be the Klangum MJUC. You know, I'm fond of this compressor. We have a video on it. I use this all the time, maybe just one instance, but very often on many mixes. And actually I used it recently on the 2-bus along with the hardware, just for its color, because I don't have any hardware Varimu or tube compressor at the moment, and this one doesn't make me feel like I'm missing too much not having the hardware. It's an amazing plugin. I still see it as one of the best sounding hardware emulation out there. My favorite application is vocals, bass, acoustic instruments, pianos. When its color fits, anything goes really. Drums too. I like Model 1 and 3 the best. My next favorite would be the Alpha compressor, the master version. This is my favorite for mastering purposes, hands down, great one. Lots of flexibility, really transparent. Love the sidechain, love the EQ, love the different modes. And as you've seen in our popular loudness is not in mastering video, I have a special trick with it. I love to use its clipper on drums. It works great for taming tall transients and reducing nominal gain transparently if you don't abuse it. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it down below. Lastly, what I use as my fourth stereo parallel compression channel, the Soft Tube Dynamite. If I want something smashed really hard, this is it. A punch and color for days, a very unique behavior. I love this plugin a lot. Snappy snares, parallel vocals, wacky effect, hard gating. It's great when you want grit and dirt and snap. It has such a recognizable sound. It's so fun, and it really has an analog vibe to it. Softtube did just a great job with it.